I just built my second home observatory, this Roll Off Roof Observatory. My first observatory was a 10-foot domed observatory. And in the process of building 2 home observatories, I've learned a lot. So if you're thinking about building a home observatory, watch this video and I'll tell you what I've learned through the process and give you some tips and things to think about before you start your own observatory project. Hello and welcome to the program Sula's Big Adventures with me, Sula. In this video, I'm going to share with you my experiences building 2 home observatories and give you some suggestions and things for you to think about and tips if you're thinking about building a home observatory, so you won't have the same mistakes that I did along the way. Tip number 1. The very first thing you need to do before starting a home observatory project is something that I mentioned in my first video about my original observatory, the 10-foot home dome, and that is to check your HOA rules or local ordinances or local laws to make sure you're even allowed to build an observatory on your property. Way back when I built the first observatory, I checked, and here in southwest Montana, there weren't any laws or ordinances or HOA rules restricting me from building an observatory, and I didn't even need a building permit. But you should check wherever you live. Tip number 2, think carefully about what kind of observatory you want and what you intend to do with it. There are many kinds of observatories available today that you could build. The most common are the domed observatories and roll-off roofs, like this one. You can build your own, or you can purchase the parts and have them shipped to your house and you build it. There's Next Dome Observatory in Canada that manufactures the parts for a very small domed, up to 8 feet, I think, dome observatory, or a steel domed observatory, or a small roll-off roof observatory, very small. And also Sky Shed Pods makes one that can be built on any flat surface or foundation. One side of the roof opens and folds back on itself, but they're very small and they barely hold 1 telescope and 1 person. And then there's Technical Innovations out of Florida that makes 6-foot, 10-foot, and 15-foot domed observatories with fiberglass parts that they ship to you in a large crate, and you must assemble it. You can purchase the home dome as a manual dome that rotates and has a shutter that opens and closes manually, or you can purchase the electronics to make it fully operable with a hand controller or with a computer, or even remotely if you set that up with a remote computer and the appropriate software. I saw their ad in Sky and Telescope magazine, and it seemed like a good product. Their website said that it was easy to install and anyone could do it. Since I live in an area undergoing profound development, it can be very difficult here in southwest Montana to find decent contractors. And the first mistake I made was thinking that a home dome observatory would be very easy to assemble and install, and that I would be able to easily find someone to put it together for me. Boy, was I wrong. I didn't give enough thought to how I intended to use this observatory. My observation is that the majority of people who want a home observatory want it for a place to set up their astrophotography equipment. Then there is another group of people who want a home observatory so they can leave their gigantic telescope set up and not have to set it up and take it down each time they want to observe. And then there is another group who want an observatory in order to invite the public or have public events. For example, the 15-foot home dome in Chaco Canyon National Historical Park is for public events. These groups are not mutually exclusive, but they definitely have different needs. The electronic version of the home dome made by Technical Innovations that I ended up purchasing was definitely designed with the astrophotographer in mind. They have an excellent product, and if set up properly, it can be used by astrophotographers remotely, and it will work great. It has all kinds of features to ensure that the dome works properly to make your astrophotography super easy to conduct from the luxury of your home. And your home can be hundreds of miles away. However, contrary to what the website says, it is not easy to assemble. I recommend that if you want a home observatory for astrophotography, this is the one to get, the home dome. But only buy it if it fits in your budget because they are not cheap, and get the electronic version. But only if you are a contractor yourself, or you know a skilled contractor, or you're what I call a tinkerer, somebody who likes to tinker. You know the type. They own lots of tools. They like to spend a lot of time in their garage and or on the computer. And let me tell you, that is not me. I abhor home projects. First of all, I fit into a category of people who want a permanent home for their astronomy equipment so they don't have to constantly set it up and take it down and polar align every night. And I have no interest in using my home observatory for astrophotography, either at home or remotely, not even remotely. I had it in my head, though, that if I could find a contractor at all, which can be challenging in an area undergoing massive development, that I would need to have an observatory that was easy to build. And I had the insane mistaken belief that the home dome would be easier to assemble and build than a roll-off roof. I was completely and utterly wrong. I found a contractor who made a bid on my project, and he said he could pour a foundation for me. It was supposed to be 12 feet by 12 feet, assemble the fiberglass parts, put in electricity running from my garage to the observatory, and set up the electronics. I accepted his bid, and right after I accepted it, the guy who prepared the bid quit and moved back to Georgia. And the company had no replacement. I waited and waited, and finally the company I had hired, CS Structures, owned by this guy named Levi's, assigned a carpenter to my project. A carpenter. CS poured the foundation, and it's not 12 by 12, but that's a different story. After several months, I finally got this carpenter to come out and start the project. He told me he didn't know anything about electricity. I was appalled. I didn't know what to do. They had already poured the foundation, and the crate with the fiberglass parts and electronics was sitting out in my meadow waiting, and winter was about to start. I knew that carpenter was in way over his head, but what could I do at that point? That poor guy slogged through the project. He was miserable. He told me that reading the instruction manual made him physically sick. I told him to call Jerry, the owner of Home Dome, who offered to help and offered to talk to this carpenter on the phone. And the carpenter just refused to call Jerry. The carpenter had to hire an electrician to help him put the electricity from the garage to the dome. And I believe that they proceeded without even reading the instruction manual. They didn't know what they were doing. Sure enough, the carpenter did not install the cables correctly that open and close the shutter electronically. And over the next 2 years, after they told me the project was complete and demanded that I pay the balance due, the cables came off or snapped in two 13 times. I only got to use that observatory 4 times in 2 years. CS Structures refused to refund me any money and instead relentlessly sent out that hopelessly lost carpenter over and over and over. When they refused to refund me, and it was obvious that this carpenter didn't know what he was doing or how to make it work, I asked them to take the dome apart so I could sell it. The carpenter told me that he would take it apart. He did take down the electronics, which worked fine, by the way. He just didn't install it correctly. But he took down the electronics and put them in a box and disappeared. He never came back despite repeated phone calls. So I listed the home dome for sale, and some guy from California was very interested in it. And within a week, he rented a U-Haul and drove it out here to Montana from California, which is far. This guy was a tinkerer, and he knew all about electricity and how to build things and how to put things together. He owned lots of tools. He was the perfect person to own a home dome. The day he came, though, it snowed about 14 inches, and I was shoveling snow off the stairs all morning long. He pulled up in this 26-foot U-Haul, and he spent the day carefully taking the home dome apart and putting it into compartments and putting it into his U-Haul. I helped him as much as I could, and he drove away. I'm sure he's very happy with it. He's the kind of person who should get a home dome. A tinkerer. He told me he wanted to use it for, guess what? Astrophotography. So tip number 3 is, are you going to build it? Do you know a competent builder or contractor who can build it for you? Do you really need it to be electronic? Because even though a roll-off roof does have its advantages, it has drawbacks too. They have a bigger footprint, the rails will most likely shift over time, and it may become difficult as the years roll by for the roof to roll off on those rails. But on the other hand, contrary to my mistaken belief that the home dome would be easy to assemble, in fact, roll-off roofs are very easy to put together, or easier than an electronic dome. After selling my home dome, I still had a foundation, and it looked weird, and I wanted to do something with it, but I was still reeling from blowing my inheritance my dear mother left me after she passed away, blowing it on the carpenter who did a terrible job and didn't know what he was doing. If you live in southwest Montana, do not hire CS Structures to build your home observatory or anything. As this tinkerer guy from California who bought my home dome was leaving my driveway, he told me that I could purchase building plans for $40 from Backyard Observatories. I had never heard of Backyard Observatories. They don't even come up when you Google home observatory on the internet for some reason. But after he told me that, I looked up Backyard Observatories, and it came up, their website, and they sell plans for roll-off roof observatories, and they'll even build it for you. However, if you want to have Backyard Observatories build a roll-off roof for you, I think you'll probably have to wait a very long time. I mailed them $40, and it took them 3 months just to get the plans to me. And I'm guessing there's a 2-year wait to get them to build one for you, so I didn't even try. After I got the plans, I wasn't sure what to do. There was no way I was going to use CS Structures again. I felt and still feel that they owe me money for failing to execute on the contract, but I have to let it go. I was heartbroken that I wasted my dear mother's money that she left me on that terrible company and that boondoggle project. And then, out of nowhere, my friend Joy, who was born and grew up here in Montana, told me about this old guy who could build my roll-off roof for me. She gave me his number, and I called him. And I told him what I wanted, and I explained everything, and I emailed him the plans that I had bought from Backyard Observatories, and he came out and took a look at my foundation, and the first thing he told me was that they had done a terrible job on the foundation. I'm not surprised at all. They poured it while it was snowing, and the new guy, Jim, said that the foundation wasn't even squared, and it wasn't 12 feet by 12 feet. And they left this horrible styrofoam that they had used for the forms all the way around the perimeter. Awful and ugly too. Well, anyway, Jim said he could work around it, and he quoted me a price that seemed very reasonable, in addition to me having to buy the parts, which I think totaled about $3,500. And he started right away. His name is Jim Del Duca. If you live in southwest Montana, I highly recommend Jim Del Duca. He showed up in a 1992 Suburban with his colleague Jake, and they were so nice and so competent and skilled. They worked so hard, and they checked in with me every step of the way. They made sure that I would be able to open and close the roof, which is somewhat difficult. These plans are just the bare minimum, the basics, and Jim and Jake had to improvise quite a bit in places. For example, the plans only call for a handle on the roof. Well, I'm 5'2", and I can barely touch the roof. There was no way I was going to be able to roll that thing off from the floor by myself. Jim and Jake told me that it took the two of them together to get the roof to start rolling. And they were afraid for me to stand on a ladder. So Jake designed a pulley system for me. And it works great. And the pulley system opens and closes the roof. And toward the end of the project, since it snows so much up here at 6,200 feet, we decided to install a heating cable inside the angle iron rails to keep ice off of the rails in the wintertime. And that's the sort of thing these two contractors did for me. And I am so grateful. I went way over budget, but it was well worth it. I could not be happier with the work Jim Del Duca and Jake did for me. I heartily and highly recommend both of them. Tip number 4. If you're thinking about a roll-off roof, keep in mind that your roof should roll off north if you live in the northern hemisphere, and make sure you can see Polaris with the roof in place rolled off. And speaking of that, some people bury their pier into the foundation. I didn't do that, but I made sure that Jim put the pier back. He had moved it so it wouldn't be in the way, so that it was facing true north, and he even leveled it for me by putting some washers underneath. And it's facing north, and it's perfectly leveled, and I can just barely see Polaris over the top of the roof with it rolled off. But I did not reinstall the extension pier I had on here because the telescope nearly hits the center beam of the roof when the roof is closed, and I intend to leave this thing on here forever. All the time. As y'all may know, I don't like lifting this 30-pound telescope. By the way, thank you to whoever told me about Alan Shivano's video showing how he gets his 14-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope onto his mount by using a table. My table wasn't quite tall enough, but it reached perfectly with the complete works of William Shakespeare on top of the table and underneath the telescope. And that's how I got it on here. And that way I can now easily get it onto this mount without fear of dropping it. But back to my roll-off roof. You don't want your walls too high though, because then you won't be able to see all the way to the horizon. In fact, this roll-off roof observatory has a south-facing wall, that I'll show you in a minute, that folds down partially. It's very heavy and it's hard for me to lift it back into place, but Jake told me if I have trouble, as I get older, he'll come back and put a pulley on the folding wall as well. One great thing about the roll-off roof is that I have so much more room in here than I did with the dome. Here's where the ring was for the dome, and you can see that I can now fit 2 tables and a chair, and I have space maybe even for another small telescope in here. On the downside, it's manual, so if you were hoping to use a roll-off roof remotely, you would need to either build a warm hut behind the observatory that you would sit in, underneath where the rails go, or buy electronics to make the roof electronically open and close. And in fact, Backyard Observatory sells such a device. I can't speak to how it works though. And Jake said he could make the pulley system electronic for me, but I have no interest in it. I'm not going to use my observatory for astrophotography. It's for me to come in here protected from wild animals outside, to have a dry, secure place to leave my telescope set up so I can observe anytime without much effort and without putting the telescope off and on that's very heavy. The dome was much higher than this roll-off roof, and a 6-foot tall person could stand in the middle of it, whereas my roll-off roof door is just barely higher than I am tall, which is fine with me. Obviously, you'll have to run electricity out to your observatory if you intend to make it electronically operated, and that will add to your cost. But a manual roll-off roof is the cheapest option. I mean, it depends on the size you want, with small observatories being much cheaper, but not nearly as versatile as a larger one. The Sky Shed pod, for example, starts around $3,600 US plus shipping for an 8-foot high and 8-foot diameter structure, and it goes up from there in cost. But those things are tight. They say they can hold a 14-inch telescope, but there's very little room for you or for anything else. The next dome also starts around $3,000 US and goes up from there. Neither of these include construction cost. And the home dome, 6-foot dome, starts at $6,000. That doesn't include electronics. The 10-foot home dome is about $11,000. And with the electronics, about $15,000. And the 15-foot home dome is $26,000 plus electronics. Again, this is not including the foundation you'll need, and construction cost and electricity if you opt for electronics. Whereas the roll-off roof from Backyard Observatories, they will build a 9-foot 6-inch one for $6,900, an 11-foot 6-inch one, which is what mine is, for $7,900, and they have bigger ones that go up from there. But as I said, they're very busy. But that at least gives you an idea of the cost you might be looking at, and that's not including the construction materials that you'll need to buy. And for me, they were about $3,500, I think. Tip number 5, or really just something to think about, is that one day you might sell your house or your property, and then you might want to take your observatory with you. And in that case, the home dome or sky shed pod would be ideal and the easiest to take down and transport to your new location. Whereas a roll-off roof, probably you'll need to leave it behind. But at least they appear to look like a shed, so the new buyer shouldn't be too bothered by it being on the property. Just one more thing to think about. I used my roll-off roof observatory briefly last night. It was partly cloudy and there was some heat lightning in the distance. And I just installed it, so I had to polar align it, but at least it's already on the mount and ready to go. And I have electricity running in here, and I power this mount from the electrical outlet. And it was very nice and cozy, and I'm very happy. So thank you to Jim, thank you to Jake, and thank you to my friend Joy, the J stars. So I hope you found my tips useful and that they gave you some things to think about before embarking on a project to build a home observatory. That's it for now. I'll see y'all soon. Until then, get outside and enjoy the night sky. Dark skies forever. Sula signing off.